Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Francesca Rozowska. I'm Chief Executive of Nature Scot, Scotland's nature agency. And as I'm sure you know, Nature Scot works to improve our natural environment in Scotland and inspire everyone to care more about it. I'm really pleased to chair this session today because of the links between nature restoration and renewable energy. We cannot address nature degradation without tackling climate change. And a key plank of Scotland's climate response is renewable energy. It is only by addressing the twinned issues of nature and climate that we can secure a healthy and prosperous future for Scotland. We need renewable energy to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and reduce our carbon emissions, whilst a nature-rich future will provide us with greater resilience to the effects of climate change. And both are partial success stories. Our renewable energy sector is over 3 times bigger than it was at the end of 2009. Our natural habitats onshore and in the sea continue to provide essential carbon sinks, as well as supporting wildlife and landscapes that make Scotland such a great place to live, work and visit. But I deliberately say partial because we are in an emergency. Have we done enough? Whilst we must not convey a sense of panic, we have got to recognise that we need to do more of both and more quickly. And we need to do both together. The nature and climate crises are one. Combining development and nature does, of course, present challenges, and yes, there is a balance to be struck. As our speakers will show, we have been delivering a lot of renewable energy projects in Scotland that are sensitively located and designed and deliver for nature. We have the know-how, the skills and the desire to meet the challenge. But at the risk of putting more pressure on our speakers, I like to view it as less of a balance or compromise and more as a common aim to find the win-wins. From Nature Scot's perspective, a win-win is renewable energy development means operating from good locations with well-designed, viable energy projects, whilst also increasing biodiversity and strengthening our climate change resilience. For example, whilst we know Scotland's peatland is a very important resource in acting as a carbon sink, 70% of it is degraded and currently a source of carbon emissions. Not good. At the same time, carefully designed wind farm developments on upland sites are providing an opportunity for restoring some of this degraded peatland and its carbon capturing properties. That's a win-win. On a more strategic front, the sectoral plan for offshore wind is helping to look after the marine environment whilst delivering a thriving, sustainable offshore renewable sector in Scotland. The plan is securing ambitious but viable options for development alongside helping nature. We are particularly encouraged by the opportunities the ScotWind leasing round offers for wind projects further out to sea to secure the kind of win-wins we have seen elsewhere with renewable energy developments. Our speakers today are providing this leadership in developing and implementing nature-based solutions, crucial to successful development. They will show how we can deliver both the renewable energy we need and the nature-rich future that are essential to tackling climate change. We're starting with David MacArthur, an ecologist and environmental economist from MacArthur Green, a carbon-negative environmental consultancy which specialises in support to the renewable energy sector. David is going to cover the importance of nature-based solutions in reaching net zero and how the renewable sector can play a role. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Francesca. So today I'm going to talk about, let's see if we get my slides up, there we are. So today I'm going to talk about the role of nature-based solutions in achieving net zero. So in particular, I'll cover the questions of what are nature-based solutions, where do they fit in the overall carbon reduction picture, and how important are they to achieving the 2030 Paris Agreement targets. Then I'll turn to the question of can the Scottish renewables sector be global leaders by setting a net zero best practice standard. And specifically I'll cover what are the opportunities for the renewables industry, And what could a net zero best practice standard look like? So before I go in any further, I will just give you some background to how I have become involved in nature-based solutions and also the net zero discussion. So I would say the thing that gives me a great deal of enjoyment and purpose is working with like-minded folk on projects which ultimately deliver a positive impact on the environment. And that is at the core of my company, MacArthur Green, with working within a carbon negative business model being one of our key objectives. Now, what kicked me into action with this and made me transition the company to a carbon negative company was a lot of the discussion surrounding the Paris Agreement in 2016, when it was very simply put that tackling the climate emergency involves us changing the way that we all live and work. And I thought to myself that as an environmental consultancy, we should really be leading the way in demonstrating best practice in this area. So this led us to develop our own nature-based solution. We planted an area of land and we planted our own native woodland of almost 30,000 native trees, which is registered under the Woodland Carbon Code. So that woodland is estimated to sequester 10,000 tonnes of carbon over the next 100 years. So if anyone is interested in learning more about how we've done that, just click through on the links on our website and you will see all the advice note, including all the costs that have been involved in achieving that. Okay, so what are nature-based solutions? Well, they are projects which invest in the natural environment. They help tackle climate change in two ways: through conserving or enhancing carbon sinks, so mitigating the impact of climate change, and they can also improve the health of ecosystems, helping them to adapt to climate change. Now, at the moment, there are two types of projects that are recognised on the UK Land and Carbon Registry, and these are woodland planting projects and peatland restoration projects. So this means that the carbon units from these projects can be officially used as offsets in the voluntary carbon market. So with woodlands, carbon units generated depend on the volume of carbon the woodland sequesters over its lifetime, over its 100-year period, so therefore creating a sink. And with peatlands, the carbon units generated depend on restoring peatlands to stop the loss of carbon from degraded bogs. So protecting a sink and reactivating that sink from a degrading bog to an active bog. So these projects are backed ultimately by the UK government via the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, which just really came into existence in terms of formally claiming the carbon from it in December last year. My internet, there we are, it's working. So it's estimated that there is around 2 trillion tonnes of excess carbon in the atmosphere already, with 50 billion tonnes more being added every year, and this can take thousands of years to dissipate. So this is why we're in the unfortunate position of trying to limit the impact of climate change on humanity and the natural environment rather than avoiding any impact. So the key focus has to be minimising future emissions by measuring your footprint and reducing your emissions year on year. However, offsets have a fundamental role to play in meeting the Paris Agreement targets. It is estimated that greenhouse gas emissions will be 32 billion metric tonnes higher in 2030 than they need to be in order to meet the Paris Agreement target. So that's a huge number that we're off by. So that these emissions have to be removed by either offsets or increasing emission reduction targets through nationally determined contributions. But ultimately, it's going to be a mix of the two. So there needs to be a mix of technology offsets, which is wind and solar, in developing countries, and nature-based offsets. It can't all be done by nature-based offsets, but they're going to play an important role in delivering the Paris Agreement targets. Now, nature-based solutions have important additional benefits over technology offsets, and these include biodiversity benefits, ecosystem resilience, improving ecosystem function, so that's purifying water, and also flood attenuation. There's many different types of ecosystem function that they improve, but importantly, they can have important community and social economic benefits through the investment required in local communities. Now, what's really interesting at the moment is that we're seeing a huge increase in private finance into nature-based solutions. And this is ultimately being driven by corporate ambition to meet net zero and have an environmental and socio-economic benefit of doing that. And it's ultimately the reason why nature-based solutions tend to get a higher price per tonne of carbon in the voluntary carbon markets. Now, we're seeing this reflected in the carbon offset market, which is currently worth around $300 million a year, and that's predicted to increase to the hundreds of billions a year, according to Mark Carney, who's a UN Special Envoy on Climate and Action Finance, and he is tasked with upscaling the carbon markets so it can respond to the demand that is foreseen for combating climate change and companies going net zero. Okay, so what are the opportunities for the renewable sector to invest in and support nature-based solutions? Well, firstly, if we look at what the Scottish renewables industry has already achieved and do as a matter of best practice. Now, habitat management plans have now been around for about 20 years or so, and they're a standard and proven approach for compensating losses to habitats and impacts on species that may arise out of the wind farm development. Now, these plans commonly include blanket bog restoration measures and tree planting. In fact, Scottish Renewables released a really good paper end of last year on the wind power in peatlands, which gives a fantastic summary of some of the schemes and some of the work that's been done, which includes examples from Scottish Power, SSE, RWE, to name a few. So you can see from that the vast scale of money that's been invested and also the extent of the schemes that have been delivered. Now, one thing that's really important to remember in terms of the contribution industry's made already and the knowledge base that they've generated is the work that's been done on developing effective restoration techniques, particularly from forestry sites which probably shouldn't have been planted in the first place, to active peatland sites. So the paper there that I've got in the screenshot is from Peter Robson and Rachel Short at Scottish Power Renewables, and they've developed techniques such as wave damming and ground smoothing, which have been proven to be highly effective at actually reactivating a blanket bog system after the huge disturbance of commercial forestry, which is amazing work, and that will help to allow future forestry to peatland projects to probably be included in the Woodland Carbon Code, which they aren't at the moment. So the industry has developed a vast amount of experience in this area. Now, forgive me for this slide, it's quite text heavy, but I've got quite a lot to try and get across. So there's loads of expertise in this area, but how do we use this expertise to invest in nature-based solutions going forward? Well, I think if we get this right, we could be in a position where renewables could supercharge investment in nature-based solutions. And this is a very exciting time, I think, for the industry and for investment in this kind of work. So what do I mean by this? Well, firstly, the opportunities for nature-based solutions could be considered by the developer at the outset of the development or repowering of a scheme in discussions with the landowner. For example, sites are often being developed as multi-use, so wind, solar, battery storage. So why not include investments in woodland carbon and peatland carbon projects as part of that bundle? Secondly, to fairly incentivise this, it needs to be possible for developers to claim carbon units and the carbon finance for these projects. Now, the reason this may not be possible at the moment is the blurry line between what is necessary to compensate for the impacts of the development and what is over and above compensation, referred to as additionality or enhancement. So this requires agreement on a method for determining additionality over and above compensation, which we don't have at the moment. Now, if an agreed approach to additionality can be agreed, then this would mean that carbon units could be claimed, contributing to net zero targets. It could also lead to larger scale integration of woodland and peatland restoration projects with renewables to secure higher volumes of carbon units and greater investment in nature-based solutions. So that's maybe one to pick up on in the group discussion. Okay, so finally, taking advantage of these opportunities for renewable developments to invest in nature-based solutions could form an important part of a net zero best practice standard for the industry. Now, the renewable sector is already playing a massive role in combating the climate emergency. And I believe that we should be delivering this in a way which minimises carbon emissions of delivering that. And we should be a leading sector in demonstrating the effectiveness of net zero business models and carbon negative business models. So what do I think this looks like? Well, it's fairly straightforward, really. Firstly, it would involve the annual measurement of the carbon footprint. You need to measure it to understand how you can reduce it. And at the moment, only large companies have to legally do this. Secondly, it requires setting a meaningful carbon management or carbon reduction plan, which sets clear objectives for reducing direct emissions, but also clear objectives for reducing the scope 3, the indirect emissions that come from the value chain or the supply chain. Now, a key point I'd like to emphasise here is that measuring or influencing the supply chain emissions is optional for any company at the moment. But it is key to creating behavioural change in the value chain. It involves creating requirements in the procurement process to signal to suppliers that carbon reduction is valued in the price mechanism. Ultimately, we want to internalise the previous external cost of carbon. So we're internalising that into the price mechanism, which is where it belongs. So from my own experience over the last 12 years of running MacArthur Green, I've never come across this requirement. We work with government, with utilities, with other developers and the charitable sector, and we haven't seen it yet. If anyone's got any good examples out there to share, it'd be great to hear about it. Now, this inadvertently says that it is not considered as part of the value of the price, which I'm sure most of us would strongly disagree with. So finally, once the carbon footprint's been measured and the carbon reduction's in place, it's all about offsetting the remaining footprint, but offsetting means supporting investment in nature-based solutions and directing finance into that area for that additional biodiversity benefit. Okay, my last slide. So it is a climate emergency, so it means action. So I think it's appropriate to leave with a couple of key actions to take forward from my presentation. So the first one, to develop a task force to develop the Scottish Renewables best practice standard for net zero. And secondly, a task force to develop an additionality criteria for developments to promote investment in nature-based solutions? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, David. I'm sure we'll explore a lot of that in the Q&A. We're now going to hear from Annie Breeden, who's from the Crown Estate, where she is Head of Policy at Crown Estate Scotland and has been with the organisation since its establishment in 2017. Annie leads on marine planning and policy, working closely with a number of key stakeholders on strategic issues in the development of the organisation's climate change action plan. So over to you, Annie.
Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll assume you can. Here's my first slide. Okay, so I'm obviously really pleased to have the opportunity to speak here today. First of all, I'm just going to give some background on Crown Estate Scotland, and then I'll look at some of our activities which relate to biodiversity, and then focus in on Scotland's strategic approach to offshore wind development, which aims to ensure that offshore wind in Scotland's waters, which are very rich in biodiversity, can be developed sustainably. So, okay, yep. So Crown Estate Scotland is a public corporation. We were established in 2017 and we're governed by Scottish Crown Estate Act 2019. So we're a very young organisation. We manage property, including seabed, coastline, land and buildings on behalf of Scotland's people. And as many of you will be aware, we lease the seabed out to 12 nautical miles for activities such as offshore wind. And we also have the rights to lease for offshore wind and other renewables and carbon dioxide storage out to 200 nautical miles. You can see here our purpose of investing in property, natural resources and people to generate lasting value for Scotland. And then you can see our 5 strategic objectives as set out in our current corporate plan. So in terms of biodiversity and climate change, I thought I'd just touch on a few of our activities to sort of help demonstrate the breadth of what we do and how we operate as an organisation. So as Francesca mentioned, our climate change action plan, I'm delighted to be able to say that we published that, our first plan, last week. And this commits us to zero direct emissions by 2040, although there may be scope to bring that date forward as our understanding of our baseline emissions develops. So the plan sets out some key actions for us over the short, medium and long term. These include establishing our emissions baseline, reporting this to Scottish Government, and we'll develop green office and travel plans. We'll complete a carbon audit of our Glen estate. We'll identify woodland creation sites on our rural estates. We'll complete our Mussack peatland restoration project at our Glen estate. We'll promote sustainable agricultural business. And then we have many actions relating to the development of renewable energy as well. Then you can see here the Scottish Crown Estate Act, and this requires us as an organisation to further sustainable development and also to promote economic development, regeneration, social well-being and environmental well-being. So to help us do this, we set up our value project, and this helps us to understand the wider value that as an organisation we are delivering. So the outputs from the project are now starting to be used. So for example, for investment decisions, we must consider wider economic, social, regeneration environment and also climate change benefits, so not just financial returns. And under the environment category, we have specific indicators that need to be reported on. So these are for environment, biodiversity, natural resources and pollution prevention. So we're really building in all of this wider value consideration into our decision making. And then last year we launched our Sustainable Communities Fund. This is a 3-year programme with £750,000 available. We've got 2 strands. We've got our environment programme, or tenant who we want to support more environmentally friendly ways of operating, for example, planting native woodland and hedgerows on farms. And then we have community capacity grants, which are designed to support early stage projects which are capable of delivering local socio-economic benefits. So then, I'm just trying to move my slides on. Okay, so as I noted, and as I'm sure many of you will know, Crown Estate Scotland leases seabed for offshore wind projects in Scotland. And you can see here the scale of development to date, together with Scotland's offshore wind ambition over the coming decades. Marine Scotland's sectoral plan for offshore wind has identified suitable areas for up to 10 gigawatts of development, and Scottish Government's recent offshore wind policy statement had sets out ambitions for 11 gigawatts of offshore wind to be operational by 2030. Then also you can see here the importance of Scotland's marine environment in terms of biodiversity. So how can we ensure that offshore wind development in Scotland is done sustainably? So Scotland is adopting a very strategic approach to do this. Firstly, we have a plan-led approach. So Marine Scotland's published Scotland's first National Marine Plan back in 2015, and this provides an overarching framework for all marine activities in Scottish waters. And then in October of last year, Marine Scotland published the Sectoral Marine Plan for offshore wind, and this provides the spatial framework for commercial scale offshore wind development in Scotland. And the plan was published alongside its accompanying SEA and HRA assessments. A huge amount of work was put into the plan, and there was really significant efforts, especially in terms of stakeholder engagement, to ensure that all relevant data and stakeholder views were considered. And then now that Marine Scotland have identified the areas that are suitable for development, we are now running our ScotWind leasing process to award development sites in line with the spatial framework in the plan. So alongside this strategic planning framework, I've gone on to the last slide. Let me go back. Sorry. So alongside this strategic planning framework, offshore wind development in Scotland is progressing against a strong backdrop of strategic research. And strategic research is really important, as many offshore wind projects are huge developments in geographic areas where there hasn't really been any development before. And to support decision making, there's a lot of information which is needed that it would really be unreasonable to expect individual developers to provide. So there's a number of strategic research programmes underway, including ScotMer, which is led by Marine Scotland, and ORGIP Offshore Wind, which is Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Programme. And that's managed by the Carbon Trust and funded primarily by offshore wind developers, with some additional support from organisations such as ourselves. And so all these research programmes have a sort of common approach of stakeholders collaborating to identify and answer key strategic questions, many of which relate to biodiversity. So these will be considering assessment methodologies, new survey data to improve the evidence base, and looking to understand the potential interactions between the projects and the marine environment. And ultimately, they're all helping to ensure robust planning and consenting decisions. And I know David and some of his team at MacArthur Green are certainly working on many of these projects. So Crown Estate Scotland is currently partnering with Marine Scotland to part fund some of the current ScotMer priority projects. So that includes a strategic review of bird migratory routes, project understanding seabird behaviour at sea, and a project looking at marine mammal dynamic energy budgets. So strategic research can also be delivered at the regional scale. And so we've seen the offshore wind developers in the Moray Firth and in the Forth and Tay collaborating on joint monitoring projects to understand especially bird and marine mammal activities in their regions. And then another strategic initiative I'd like to highlight is the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund. So this is an initiative which is has received seed funding from Crown Estate Scotland, from Marine Scotland and Nature Scot, and also a number of offshore wind developers. And so although the expectation is that in the longer term, other marine users will also contribute to the fund on a voluntary basis. And the fund is aiming to support marine and coastal environmental enhancement projects through providing grants. And it reflects the fact that Scotland's seas are a really rich resource of natural capital, but also a shared space, so supporting a wide range of marine industries. And the purpose of the fund is really to enable users of the marine environment who benefit from the resource to be able to voluntarily reinvest into the health and biodiversity of our seas. So it's still at sort of seed funding stage, but it's being worked up, and hopefully towards the end of this year there'll be more information available on it. Sorry, my clicking is not seamless. There we go. So to summarise then, a few key learnings I thought for us. What is really important in helping to make sure offshore wind is done sustainably? I think a plan-led approach, strategic research to support planning and consenting decisions, and then collaboration between key stakeholders is absolutely vital, because the rollout of offshore wind is both, it's exciting and challenging, and we all need to work together to make it happen, and to make it happen sustainably. So so it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of resource from people, but it needs expertise from a huge range of stakeholders. But together it can be made to happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annie. That was absolutely great. And again, I'm sure we'll pick up much of that in the Q&A. I'm now really pleased to welcome Claire Gilchrist, who is an offshore consents manager with Edf Renewables. She joined Edf Renewables in 2019, and since then has been responsible for coordinating pre-construction phase licenses, discharging post-consent conditions, and monitoring construction phases. Claire represents Scottish Renewables within multiple specialist groups to deliver advice on environmental compliance, so is the perfect speaker for our conference. So can I hand over to Claire, please?
Perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction, Francesca. So today I'm going to talk about the environmental monitoring undertaken at Nautnaguir offshore wind farm, and how this really fits in with the wider theme of Scotland leading the way in addressing some of the big questions around biodiversity and offshore renewables. So Edf Renewables is one of the UK and Ireland's leading renewable energy companies. We specialise in offshore and onshore wind, solar and battery storage technology. Our goal is to accelerate to a net zero future where clean energy really powers our lives. So the three pillars of people, nature and technology, which frame this COP26 conference, really resonates. Within Edf Renewables, our teams develop and use best available techniques to tackle environmental impacts and reduce our carbon footprint. We recognise the importance of biodiversity to tackling climate change and to protect a cleaner, healthier and more resilient environment that then benefits society and our economy. So across the UK, we have 37 onshore wind farms, 2 offshore wind farms, and one of the largest battery storage units in Europe currently operational. So I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to Nautnaguir offshore wind farm, and then an overview of the Forth and Tay Regional Advisory Group that Annie mentioned. I'm going to focus on the ornithology and the marine mammal monitoring. And then finally, I'll give an overview of the lessons learned during this process. So Náut na Gaoithe, meaning strength of the wind in Gaelic, and thankfully also widely known as NNG Wind Farm, is expected to be operational in 2023. We originally gained consent in 2014, and then an updated application was approved in 2018 for a reduction in the number of turbines given the advances in technology since. A key aspect of the consent, which has really led the way for the collaborative and strategic monitoring approach which we're involved in, was the inclusion of the commitment to attend the Forth and Tay Regional Advisory Group. So the Forth and Tay RAG encourages collaboration of developers' monitoring programs so that they can provide more strategic outputs. The aims are to validate or reduce uncertainty in predictions of environmental impacts and measure the effectiveness of the mitigation measures being put in place. There's a main group which covers topics such as fish biology and benthic ecology, and then two subgroups, one for marine mammals and one for ornithology. Within these groups, NNG is working closely with our neighbours, Inchcape, Seagreen, and more recently SSE with Berwick and Marbank. There's another similar RAG to the north in the Moray Firth. And alongside the developers, the groups are made up of specialist advisors from Marine Scotland, statutory and key stakeholders, and then each developer's expert advisor. And this really brings together a wealth of experience with the common goal of ensuring management of Scottish biodiversity. And the group doesn't work in isolation. It also makes full use of the links with the other research initiatives, ORGIP and Scott Mayor that Annie mentioned there, being two of those. So our seabird monitoring programme seeks to improve the understanding of seabird interactions with offshore wind turbines and to validate the assumptions made in the EIAs. 4 studies are being undertaken to understand these effects. And the first of these is a monthly digital aerial survey conducted in our wind farm area and a 12-kilometre buffer around it. This supplements monitoring undertaken at the other nearby projects, which were flown at the same time to provide coverage of a large area of the Forth and Tay region. This combined approach really improves the robustness of the data when we're comparing density and distribution over time and over this large area. NNG have also committed to continuing this survey through construction and into the operational phase. The aim of the second project there is to monitor adult gannet survival rates before and after the construction of the wind farms in the Forth and Tay. NNG, alongside Seagreen and SSE, have been co-funding the annual colouring and resighting of adult gannets at the nearby Bass Rock and then at a comparison site at Grassholm, which was started in 2010 by Leeds and Exeter universities. So the third study, also undertaken in collaboration with Seagreen and SSE, is GPS tracking and monitoring of breeding species on the nearby Isle of May. This is undertaken to monitor both displacement and barrier effects on 4 key breeding species: gannet, kittiwake, razorbill and puffins. It will also be complemented this year by tracking of kittiwakes from 2 other nearby important breeding colonies. Location fixes from the GPS trackers can be partitioned into flying and non-flying activity, which enables foraging distribution and horizontal flight lines to be mapped accurately. Again, NNG will continue the study throughout construction and for a minimum of 2-year period into the operational phase. And the final ornithology study there focuses on answering questions around collision and avoidance behaviour of seabirds, particularly gannets and kittiwakes. The scope of a collaborative study with Seagreen and SSE, which is to be based at NNG Wind Farm, is currently being designed. The study aims to improve our understanding of seabird behaviour and interactions around operational turbines, with a focus on measures of collision and flight behaviour. The 2-year operational study is the first in Scotland at a commercial-sized wind farm. The study will involve the deployment of monitoring equipment across the wind farm, and it's scheduled to take place from 2022, prior to NNG becoming operational. So NNG's environmental monitoring programme also seeks to improve the understanding of marine mammal interactions with offshore wind farms and to validate assumptions made in the EIA. The monthly digital aerial surveys mentioned previously also record marine mammal presence across the survey area. This data will help determine whether any significant changes in distribution and abundance take place during the construction phase. NNG, Inchcape and Seagreen are also contributing to regular boat surveys, which are conducted to enable the recognition of individual dolphins based on their distinguishing features. Surveys are undertaken each year between May and September in order to assess the fecundity and survival of bottlenose dolphins in the region. And data is actually showing now that these population ranges are extending further south. In recognition of the difficulties associated with surveying the population's full range, Citizen Fins has recently been launched. This project, which is led by SMRU Consulting and the University of St Andrews, is seeking photographs from members of the public to supplement data collection. And the East Coast Marine Mammal Acoustic Study has been ongoing since 2013. The project monitors the distribution and population of bottlenose dolphins and harbour porpoise through the use of acoustic monitoring devices. Seapods are deployed at 10 locations along the east coast of Scotland, and NNG have installed 4 additional seapods within and adjacent to the wind farm prior to the commencement of construction. The pre, during and post-construction detections will be compared to determine whether there was a significant change during the construction phase of the project. And the final project there was completed during the Unexploded Ordnance Clearance campaign last year. During our pre-construction surveys, a number of World War II ammunitions were found overlapping with the proposed project infrastructure. With a lack of empirical data to support UXO detonation noise modelling, NNG completed noise monitoring to help provide this important insight. 4 noise monitoring devices recorded the attempted detonations at a range of distances. The aims of the study were to predict the source level, categorise the propagation of noise, and to compare the modelled impact ranges. And the results are being fed into a BASE project led by the National Physics Laboratory and Loughborough University and should be available later this year. So I've touched quite briefly on quite a number of studies that have been undertaken in collaboration with other developers and with significant support and direction from the Forth and Tay RAG. And given the relatively novel approach to monitoring that this presents, it's useful to reflect on the lessons learned to support this approach being used elsewhere. Given the regional context of the advisory group, it inherently produces monitoring programs and research ideas of a scale that is regional and strategic in nature and requires a funding contribution of more than one developer to deliver. Stakeholders and developers bring their experience to the table during discussions, which can be really valuable in capturing lessons learned from other monitoring programs. And then on the other hand, when a collaborative program has many developers, each with their own consultancy advisors, it can take a lot of coordination effort. And the collaboration with the RAGs, although actively encouraged by other members, are driven and coordinated by the developers, which requires a large degree of transparency and cooperation. It can become difficult if developers within a RAG have different budgets, project portfolios, and EIA outcomes. And another constraint to consider is timelines. The construction timelines of developments within the group do not usually coincide. Therefore, the duration of monitoring can be quite extensive, as it will capture the pre-construction surveys through to post-construction surveys of a number of projects. But it has been known in those occasions for support to come from Marine Scotland and Nature Scot. And then finally, just there's a degree of uncertainty as to how the ScotWind projects will fit into this RAG format, especially given that the 2 main RAGs have quite distinct geographical areas in the Forth and Tay and the Moray Firth. So also how test and demonstration sites fit into the process has also been an area of discussion due to their smaller scale and comparative budgets and shorter development timelines. So that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Claire. Also very thought-provoking. And before I introduce our final speaker, if I could encourage you to put questions to the panel in the Slido feature that you see on the platform. There's some good questions coming in, but it's always good to have more. So can I now introduce Kristen Liptrot? Kristen has been working in renewable energy for almost 10 years, and she currently works for RWE Environmental and Ecology Renewables. Her site responsibilities span the length of the UK from Caithness to the south of England, which sounds fabulous. And she's been with RWE since 2018, responsible for the implementation of planning conditions of an ecological and environmental nature during operational phases, but also supports and works alongside development and construction teams. Kristen, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Francesca, for that introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for sticking around for my talk, the final talk of the day. At RWE, one of the world's leading renewable energy companies, we are committed to being carbon neutral by 2040. So that's across our entire business, not just the renewables side, but also our more traditional energy development side, including generation and power. So it's an ambitious target, but we are aware of the responsibility that comes with that role, and we exercise that responsibility in our corporate and social actions on a daily basis. And as well at RWE, we publish an annual report detailing how our employees and our company are achieving these sustainability targets. So leading on from there, today, for these next few minutes, I would like to take the opportunity to tell you a bit more about the nature of some of our sites here in Scotland. So in an onshore context, leading on from what David was talking about with traditional habitat management plans and how they have evolved and need to evolve going forward, and giving you some examples what we are doing on our sites to ensure that renewable energy sits with biodiversity enhancement as one functioning unit. So we'll go to Great. So to start, I'd like to take you up to the north of Scotland. This is Sui Wind Farm, a 13-turbine scheme in Caithness. And on the aerial image here, it's quite clear that it's a very flat site, and it's also quite wet. And we're really hoping that over the coming years, it will get wetter. That's a result of a peatland restoration scheme that we have been implementing. So we had a condition within our habitat management plan to restore approximately 39 hectares of moderately degraded peat. So during construction in 2017, we undertook the restoration project. And you can see on the aerial image the quite linear dams linear drains rather, that exist on the site. And the inset photo gives you a good idea of what these look like up close. So we used pre-existing materials from the site, sort of a commonly used technique in peatland restoration, to build a series of dams to essentially block up these drains and re-wet the area. And the dams are quite visible on the aerial image as well. If you look closely enough, you can see the efforts that have been put in here. But while we were undertaking this work to attempt to enhance and improve this degraded peatland to a more healthy functioning ecosystem, our excellent ECOW on the site, who's local and has a vested interest in the biodiversity of Caithness, brought to our attention that also in this area of Scotland, we have the great yellow bumblebee. So this is one of Great Britain's rarest bumblebees, and it is still persisting in Caithness and Sutherland. And we saw this as a great opportunity, really, with a blank substrate, a perfect place to put down some seed. So it is quite small scale, but I think we're talking about a climate emergency, a climate crisis, and we need to seize all these opportunities, really, and do everything we can. And we're all well aware, I'm sure, of the plight of our pollinators. And so we have put down some local high quality meadow mix seed over the last few years in the hopes that on our site we might provide another habitat for this species in this part of its range. So if we fast forward a couple of years, this is what Badachow Wind Farm looks like now. So the dams have held up very well, re-wetted very nicely. Sphagnum moss has recolonized the area. I can see the bog cotton in the foreground. And it's really a successful project. And we are really also quite fortunate that we have a bit of a natural experiment here at Badachow. You can see three different colored areas on the map on the left. The pink area, Area A, up at the top left, was previously experimental forestry. And that was felled and mulched for construction of the wind farm. But the area B, that's the light pale yellow area, that is an area of cut over peat. So as recently as 2016, peat was extracted from this area for heat purposes and horticultural purposes. So it's a very raw landscape in that area, and it offers another opportunity to look at the effects of our ditch blocking exercise. Area C, the green area down at the bottom, that was used for commercial peat extraction, but abandoned about 50 years ago. So more advanced in its restoration, but not quite as advanced as you might expect in this windswept landscape. So we're looking at that alongside Area D, our control, which is really an undisturbed peatland ecosystem. So we're seeing this as an opportunity to contribute to this new peatland restoration initiative, which really is developing leaps and bounds every year as new technologies come along. So we'll be monitoring vegetation on the surface and also the hydrological regime of this site for the lifetime of the wind farm, and really hoping that these reports and this data can be put to use so that we can continue to improve our peatland restoration techniques here in Scotland, that hopefully will be adapted further afield globally as well. I would now like to take you a little bit further south, just south of Inverness. This is Glen Kailaki Wind Farm, which is currently under construction. And we're going to be undertaking another peatland restoration project here later this summer, but slightly different to what I described to you at Badachow. The image on the left, the aerial image, you can see a series of turquoise lines, and those are fairly small drainage grips or channels that have been cut across the landscape. But over very long centuries and periods of time, those drains have led to a situation like you can see on the right. So the yellow lines on that aerial image depict the very pronounced peat hags and the erosion that's taken place. So this image on the right here is of peat in excess of 3.5 meters deep. So it goes right down to the mineral substrate. You can see some tree roots there that are likely circa 3,000 years old. So over time, it has been land use such as muir burn and the drainage channels, overgrazing by sheep and deer that have led to this, this eroded ecosystem. And what we're going to be doing is bringing in likely timber dams, materials from off-site to back up the water here, some reprofiling to try and slow down the movement of water, prevent further erosion, and hopefully get back to a much healthier ecosystem that can sequester carbon alongside the turbines running next door. So I mentioned that potentially one of the factors that contributed to this degraded land was some overgrazing. And I've got a photo here. I'm sure most folk identified as one of Scotland's iconic species, the red deer. What we're going to be doing is working with the local deer management group to look at the effects of grazing in this area, this habitat management area that we are restoring, but also on the wind farm itself, to look at how deer numbers and behavior may change as a result of the wind farm and the restoration efforts, but to see if there's any negative impact on the work that we've done to hopefully contribute again to further efforts for peatland restoration. And finally, I would like to take you down to the west coast of Scotland in Argyll. This is Sui Wind Farm, which was built 10 years ago. You can just about see the turbines on the horizon in the top left of that photo if you look quite carefully. And one of our planning conditions within the, again, habitat management plan for Sui Wind Farm was the installation of a series of diver rafts, so for red-throated, black-throated divers, or loons as they're known for some of our delegates here today. So we in 2010 installed 7 diver rafts on a series of lock-ins, just as you get from the photo off the wind farm itself. But we installed these rafts to provide enhanced nesting opportunities for divers, which are species of the highest conservation status here in the UK and in Europe as well. So we've been monitoring these rafts for 10 years, and they've been used by divers every single year. We've also been maintaining them to ensure that going forward there are additional nesting opportunities for these birds. So it's quite a successful project, and it will be running for the 25-year lifetime of Sui Wind Farm. And just to wrap up today, I guess a theme that very clearly has come out of this excellent conference today is the need for collaborative effort, and something that I believe we as the wind industry can do more of is sharing data that we hold to try and advance this effort to combat the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. So this is just one example, a recent one where we provided wind data to research on roosting behavior of adult golden eagles in this area. I think it's just something that really we can do, such that we're not only benefiting biodiversity on the sites themselves, as hopefully you've seen in my slides today, but also to further knowledge and further efforts, contribute to efforts on all fronts to tackle the biodiversity crisis, because we hold a lot of data that we obtain through our monitoring schemes, and there's a lot of potential to use that to act quickly, as we've said, because time really is of the essence here. So I'd like to just say thank you very much for your time, for listening in, and I'll pass it back to Francesca. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristen, and thanks to all our speakers. And we will come to Q&A in just a moment. It's good to see all the questions coming through on the Slido poll. So if you do have questions, go and look at that. You can also vote for your favourite question that's already there. But if you've been with us through the day, you will have seen that most of these sessions now begin with a poll. So we're going to continue that tradition with a poll for you, just to get you thinking about some of the issues that have been raised in the talks that we've heard from. And the poll is, which do you believe is the most important in the fight against climate change? Do you think it is technology? Do you think it is people's behaviour? And do you think it is nature? So vote on the poll. It should be coming up on the screen. I have a little advance view of the voting, and I can see that people are getting stuck in to the voting already, which is good to see. Excuse me just a moment. I'm being blinded by the light, which is lovely, but maybe not very helpful for you. Q&A, great to see all the questions coming through on the Slido poll, but I just wanted to kick off with a question to the panel. All of you have talked about collaboration in some form or other and the importance of involvement of the private sector. In your view, what are the main barriers for private sector involvement, and particularly the private sector valuing nature? Who'd like to kick off on that?
Oh,
David?
I can say something. Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
I can say something just from the perspective of my presentation, where I mentioned that I think something that's important is to encourage, if we're to encourage developers and fairly incentivize them for to invest in woodland and carbon schemes, then it's important to work out the additional benefit of that, rather than just seeing it as it is planning gain, but that shouldn't mean that they can access the same carbon finance as a private developer of these projects. Many of the developers are keen to go over and above compensation to deliver enhancement. But I do think quite often, because it's a blurry line, it's more often than not feels that it's not fully appreciated. So I think it's important to try and work out where that blurry line is and come up with an agreed method. And it would be a challenge, but I think it's possible. And if we overcome that, I think it's just fairness, really. I think it's fair that, and it would encourage much more investment, large-scale investment, I think, in these kind of schemes.
David, thanks very much. Anybody want to come in on that?
Yep, happy to do that. So I think, it's interesting to see back when the original sort of Forth and Tay and Murray Firth developer groups were set up, that it sort of seemed almost sort of novel that developers would collaborate and share data and fund projects together. And although so Claire highlighted that it's not all perfect now, you can see, I think, that for developers this is much more accepted, that this is just what you do and what you have to do. And so I suppose that's over the last 10 years, there's been a big shift in probably the perceptions of how developers go about that. I'm speaking as not a developer, but from sort of looking into it, it looks like there's been a big shift in how developers approach that sort of collaborative working with each other, which is obviously really positive.
Yeah, definitely. And sorry.
On you go.
The way that it's set up in Scotland, really, with the Forth and Tay RAG and the Moray Firth RAG, is really that supportive mechanism that's facilitated it. I know that's not the case there isn't such a framework in England currently, and I'd say that, you know, importantly, funding for such for environmental monitoring and measures needs to be earmarked early on in the project. And in order to do that, I think the feedback from regulators and statutory and key stakeholders needs to be taken into consideration, and that's really helpful feedback that they can provide that really sort of gives us those strategic inputs to where environmental management and enhancement can really be done. And having such strategic programs really do require generally more than one developer if they're particularly large. So having that framework of the regional advisory groups is really helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd agree with what everyone has said, and I think really that there still is a misconception that we're given these commitments and these planning obligations, and often when we fulfill these and even go above and beyond in some cases to provide further enhancement, it's almost met with some shock that we have taken that upon ourselves to do that. And I think once we demonstrate our willingness and our commitment to our obligations, the fluidity of how we work with the stakeholders is much enhanced, and things go very smoothly. But there is still, I think, a bit of initially with some of our new sites coming online, skepticism whether or not we will follow through. So I think that's improving, but still is a way to.
Great, thanks very much, all of you. Really helpful and thoughtful answers. I'm going to go to the poll, as they say in Eurovision now, and the question that has had the most votes, I'm going to start there, is from Beverly Walker. I think this was posted in your talk, David, but we'll open it up. Is the idea of providing a carbon offset and becoming less favourable, in that it gives the impression that businesses can keep emitting carbon and using up fossil fuel as much as they like, so long as they buy up, invest in a bit of woodland or indeed peatland anywhere. So how do we combine offsetting with behaviour change, I think is what I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
David, you said last time, let's maybe go somewhere else. Pick on Annie. Annie, any thoughts?
Well, I think I'm sure all of us would agree that ideally you want to get to sort of zero emissions, not net zero emissions. We still need some sort of transition, I think, for some areas. It's not, certainly when we've been doing our climate change action plan, we would have liked to have been able to say, this is all really easy and we'll just make a commitment and we'll do it. But, even for some things that, we have on our rural estates, we have machinery that we use that requires, diesel and things at the moment, and there simply isn't the technology that exists to allow us just to, cut those emissions out entirely at the moment. So I think there's some areas where, and for bigger organisations, then, woodland planting or whatever can help. But I think the question is sort of directing us towards, there is the danger that, that prevents real change, because I would agree with that, especially big companies can sort of advertise their sustainability credentials by, talking about net zero. But also I think in terms of language and what, the wider public understands, the differences between net zero and direct emissions and indirect emissions, this is not language that, most members of the public are likely to understand. And so maybe we need to be able to more clearly articulate and sort of really champion those who are doing a great job of actually getting to sort of zero emissions altogether. But I do think there's still a place for some sort of carbon offsetting in the journey over the next sort of couple of decades.
Thanks very much, Annie. I'm going to ask David to comment briefly, and then we'll maybe try and squeeze in another couple of questions that Claire and Kristen can respond to. So, David, thoughts on offsetting, is it a dirty word?
Not at all, but I think it's a great question. There's a healthy cynicism there, because I think some companies could be criticised for offsetting and not doing anything else in terms of reducing. As I said in my presentation, reducing your carbon emissions is the key thing. There's far too much. They're already driving climate change, and we want to stop that getting worse. So yeah, taking meaningful steps is the key thing. So we worked out that our carbon footprint, 89% of it or so is vehicle use for surveying. So we worked out that if we can change our fleet to electric, now there's constraints there because there's no commercially viable for us 4x4 electric vehicles. But we've worked out that we can actually change half our fleet to electric, and we've got an electric charge point. So that would reduce our emissions by about 40 to 50% this year. And obviously, if we can, once the electric 4x4s come in, we can get it right down to almost 10% of what it is. So yeah, I think reduction is key. Offsetting is definitely necessary.
Thanks very much, David. The clock is ticking, so one final question, and if I can just get very brief answers, and I'm going to come to Claire and then Kristen on this, and back to the subject of collaboration. In terms of renewable developments, what do you think key ecological areas are that developers would be collaborating on more? So, Claire, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And the Moray Firth and the Forth and Tay Rags have been around for a long time. They were set up, I think, in 2016, and discussions about the environmental programs for each of the developers really started at that sort of time. So quite early, I suppose, in our appreciation of environmental impacts in terms of the ecosystem approach. So monitoring is being done for marine mammals or for ornithology, but really it would have been useful probably in hindsight, and what's starting to be done now more is looking at the overall ecological approach. So taking into consideration also how sand eel distribution also affects seabird distribution, and making sure that we're capturing each of those different aspects and feeding in the information to different areas and sharing what we've collected so that we can facilitate those programs. But it is starting to be looked at definitely more now.
Excellent, that's really good to hear. And Kristen, you're getting the final word on the Q&A.
Oh, great! Well, just following on from what Claire said, is I really think an approach through all phases of planning and interoperation of our renewable schemes. It's important to be adaptable to what the changing requirements and needs are of that local community, of that country. Because oftentimes we are held to these binding planning conditions, and I think there are ways that we could use our resources more effectively and make our efforts really count. So I think we have to be willing to look at engagement from stakeholders, not just in the pre-construction phase, the planning phases, but right through into operations, and be willing to possibly change what our original plans were for the site in light of recent new targets and goals and developments.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'm just going to go back to the poll that we started at the beginning of the panel session, which is which do you believe is most important in the fight against climate change? Is it people's behaviour? Is it technology? Or is it nature? And we can see there that the view from the audience is pretty clear. People's behaviour is a really strong factor. So that was good to hear that. I would like to now thank all of our panelists, David, Annie, Claire and Kristen, for their excellent presentations, and I'm going to hand over to Morag Watson, who is Director of Policy at Scottish Renewables, who is going to close this session for us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you to all our speakers in that session. It just comes to me now to close our conference for the day, and I hope you have found it as enjoyable as I have. It's been really interesting to hear all those different perspectives and also to see all your comments coming through on the chat and all the things that people are talking about and the questions that they have at the moment. So thank you for that as well to you, our audience, for today. One of the things we would really like you to do at this point, if you can, is to go into the polls chat, which is the one you'll find between the chat tab and, we would like you to go into the polls tab, which you will find between the chat tab and the Slido tab there, and give us your feedback on this conference. In the last 12 months, we've moved everything online. This is a new way of doing things for Scottish Renewables, and we are really keen to hear what you think about the way it works and what worked for you, what didn't, what you'd like to see more of. So your feedback is really important to us to help make our event as useful to you as we possibly can. So do give us your feedback there. Of course, we need to say a huge thank you today to all of our chairs and all of our panelists today who've all given their time and their expertise so generously to share with you today their thoughts on where we're going and how we achieve net zero and how we can contribute to COP26 going forward. So thank you to all of you. We also have all our event partners and our sponsors for today. And there they are all up on the screen. I won't read them out to you, but without them, this event would not have been possible. So a huge thank you to them as well. I will, of course, remind you that all the presentations you've seen today will be available on the Scottish Renewable website. All you need to do is go to our events tab into previous events and you will find them right there. We also have a group of new upcoming events as well, and they're all appearing on the screen right now. So the two that are next in line is our annual conference on the 23rd and 24th of March. That is when the whole renewable industry in Scotland gets together to meet each other. We quite often meet in our little groups of onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, hydro, and so on. But this is where we all come together. So it's always a really exciting event, and we'd very much like to see you there. And of course, as we've heard right at the top of today, offshore wind, and at the end of the conference, offshore wind again, because it's such a big new area in Scotland. We're expecting to see a lot happening. So our offshore wind conference will be where we talk about all the exciting developments that are going to be happening over the coming decade or so. So if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in SR's events and you want to know which ones are coming up, do sign up for our update emails as well on the website. And that's when you will know the latest things that are coming up. So you can get them in your diary and you can book on. This conference that we've had today is just one part of all the work that we're doing this year around the COP26 campaign. So we will be having roadshows, there will be blogs on our website. We've got this event, and round COP itself, we'll have a whole group of other events. You can find all the information on that on our website. So do take a look at that. And finally, we know that a lot of you today who have joined us are not SR members, but we are a growing membership and we're always interested in welcoming new people to the group and into the movement that we are pushing forward here. So if you would like to join SR, so you can participate in our events, so you can take part in our policy forums, so you can get all those industry updates and all that intelligence fed into you about what's going on, then please do so. And again, it's all on the website. So on that note, I will wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We hope we will see you again at a future event, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.